Jasper. Thank you, CS. Okay, I'm just gonna list all of them so Matt doesn't have to. Kieran, Benny, Jean, Michael, Sean, Greg, Mateo, Colin, Cleo, Grace, Adam, Arthur. Also, just general people on the team, Eileen, Maria, Josh, and Elvis, Reynolds. Thanks to my friends on the circuit, Trinity, including Bridget, Thompson, Tim Romo, all those awesome. Thank you, Jar, and obviously NSC for the week. And finally, thank you, Matt, for welcoming me. Haven't been together that long, but it's been good. Okay, with that, is everyone ready? Cypress first. Matthew and I affirm resolve the United States and its economic sanctions against Venezuela. Our sole contention is a failed state. Rodriguez and Torino economic from 2019 fine. But from 2012 to 2016, the Venezuelan economy contracted because oil prices have decreased. However, after 2017, oil prices increased, meaning that the economy should have recovered. Sanctions have prevented this for three reasons. First is hyperinflation. According to a made-up balance in 2019, hyperinflation is when the prices of goods and services rise more than 50% a month. As of 2019, Venezuela's inflation rate has hit 10,398% per year. Widespread of the CDPR writes in 2019 that hyperinflations are triggered by a large external shock to government revenues and the balance of payments, as with Venezuela's sanctions. Thus, sanctions and the resulting loss of billions of dollars of foreign exchange and government revenues was very likely what pushed the economy to hyperinflation. Second is dollarization. Rosales of the Globe and Mail explained in 2019 that sanctions mean the Reserve regime desperately needs from the markets if it wants to keep the country's already diminished cash flow. That's why Long's OCY reports in 2019 that Venezuela is embracing the dollar, with over half of all financial transactions occurring in the dollar. Unfortunately, Marco Press in 2019 finds that dollarization is increasing the social gap between the small sector that has access to the dollar and the vast majority of Venezuelans who do not, which makes Venezuela the most unequal country in the world. Third, cutting oil revenues. Eden Reuters explained in 2019 that U.S. sanctions on Venezuelan oil, which account for 95% of the country's export, caused Kuwait to make a decision between doing business with Maduro or the U.S. Brendan of the CSIS in 2019 furthers that sanctions have had a crippling effect on the country's oil sector. If sanctions were lifted, oil companies could turn a profit this year as opposed to losing $23 million in the last year. Rodriguez of the Washington Post reports in 2019 that after the latest round of oil sanctions this January, there was an $8 billion loss in foregone export revenue. There are three impacts. First is creating a cycle of poverty. Rodriguez continues that financial sanctions were associated with economic losses of $16.9 billion per year. Medea of the Washington Post in 2019 estimates that the combined effect of the 2017 and 2019 U.S. sanctions led to an astounding 37.4% decline in Venezuela's GDP in 2019. Unfortunately, the wealthier are immune to sanctions. As Moreno of the Conversation writes in 2019, that trying to drain Maduro won't hurt him since he has access to dollars. When the government runs out of money, it hurts the poor who rely on the government subsidized resources to survive. Second is a loss of human capital in Venezuela. Venezuelans are fleeing because of dire conditions that sanctions have created. Nabaje of Reuters reported in 2019 that the refugee crisis has worsened since the U.S. imposed sanctions, with roughly 5,000 people leaving Venezuela. If you look at the CSS reports in 2019, that professional fields have been gutted, with 22,000 medical professionals reportedly leaving over the past 5 years alone. Interreg of the Gorgon Project notes in 2017 that 90% of the immigrants held a bachelor's degree or more. SAC of the CPS finds in 2019 that in 2018, more than 300,000 people were at risk of dying because of a lack of access to medicines or treatment. These numbers by themselves virtually guarantee that the current sanctions, which are much more severe than those implemented, are a death sentence for tens of thousands of people. Third, overwhelming neighboring countries. The Jour of Al Jazeera reports in 2019 that a tighter squeeze on Venezuela from recent U.S. sanctions will only mean more problems in neighboring countries. Our foreign policy quantified in 2019 that by 2021, the number of Venezuelans in Colombia could total 6 million. Unfortunately, Colombia is ill-equipped to handle this, as the World Bank estimates in 2019 that Venezuelan migrants cost about 0.4% of Colombia's GDP. As a larger influx of people, overburdening the system, making it fail for everyone. Bruno quantified in 2010 that a volume growth of 1% forces 20 million people into absolute poverty. Save Venezuela.
Just before I begin, also like to give a thank you my family, mom's back there. Thanks for letting us come to terms with the debate. I'll also like to thank our coaches, Mr. Cummings specifically. Like your dedication to us in this event, has meant a lot to us and really a lot of our success. Also, I'd like to thank our coaches here, Sean and Josh, for helping us and putting a lot of time into it. We really appreciate it. Then I'd like to thank all our friends. You guys all know who you are. You mean a lot to me. Yeah, and then also thank you guys. No one ready? Okay. Mitigate. And our sole contention is a sustainable solution. Venezuela is currently in the midst of the worst non-conflict related economic collapse in decades. To fully understand the crisis, a close examination of history is required. Marcellus of Cornell in 2009 explains that throughout the 1980s and 90s, Latin American governments conducted a series of liberal reforms transforming their centralized state-run economies into market-oriented, open forms of development. As a result, Manda of the Carnegie Endowment in 2015 finds that Latin America was able to transform from a period of chronic economic stagnation to a period of high growth, with inflation levels reaching a 50-year low. Financial strategies lasted decades, only lasted 2 years. In 1998, however, newly elected President Hugo Chavez took Venezuela in the opposite direction. In 2019 finds that Chavez implemented a series of inflationist policies that destroyed Venezuela's economy and set the stage for its current collapse. Widespread nationalization of entire industries destroyed Venezuela's food production, resulting in days-long blackouts, frequent water service interruptions, and bankrupt government enterprises. When Chavez chose Maduro to replace him in 2013, the situation only got worse. Even as the economy began its deadly downward spiral, honors the Council of Foreign Relations in 2017 confirms that Maduro just accelerated the authoritarian and totalitarian policies of his predecessor. This is because Corrales of Antwerp in 2018 claims that absent pressure to do otherwise, Maduro will always choose to extinguish the private sector and maintain state control over the economy, as this forces complete reliance on the government and strengthens Maduro's political power. Ultimately, the Mises Institute in 2019 confirmed that this combination of corruption, mismanagement, and widespread government monopolization caused most of the deterioration of Venezuela's socioeconomic indicators like access to food, water, and medicine long before American sanctions were implemented. Fortunately, sanctions are putting targeted pressure on Maduro's regime to spur market reform, aiming to bring forth structural economic change and reverse the policies of the previous two administrations and put Venezuela on the path to poverty reduction. Specifically, Lena de Hill in 2018 finds that sanctions have targeted Maduro's inner circle, restricting their access to capital, increasing their assets, and blocking international transactions. Not only do these sanctions prevent Maduro's inner circle from accessing their foreign fortunes and properties, it also means that any money the elites continue to make cannot be used outside of Venezuela. By preventing Venezuelan leaders from profiting off corruption, sanctions align their incentives with the incentives of the Venezuelan people, as they can only regain access to their wealth by making concessions and reforming the economy. Indeed, the Argus Institute in 2019 finds that sanctions have driven Maduro to lift nearly all state-imposed economic policies of his previous leaders. He's erased most price controls, loosened capital controls, and accepted dollarization. Because of this, expectations for Venezuela's inflation rate have fallen nearly 100-fold, and the private sector is at decades-high growth. Lopez of the VA Project in 2019 corroborates that as a result of these measures, 70% of families now have access to the dollar. Shortages of essential goods are getting filled. Business activity is stimulated, and the economy is projected to grow 4% in 2020. Negating and maintaining sanctions places sustained pressure on Maduro to make stronger concessions in the future, which is key to long-term economic liberalization and huge reductions in poverty. Such reforms, by replacing distortionary state policy with private competition and market efficiencies, will leapfrog Venezuela's development and drive wealth into the hands of the poor. In fact, a series of studies by researchers at Harvard and the World Bank found that after Chile, Brazil, and El Salvador embraced market liberalization and adopted structural reforms, they all cut poverty in half. Given that over 90% of Venezuela's population is currently in poverty, keeping sanctions and ensuring broader reform will lift tens of millions of people out of poverty. Ending sanctions before these changes are implemented throws away all of our leverage and ensures that the country remains in economic ruins well into the future. Yeah. so you're going to say that poverty increased, right? So the reason that your evidence said poverty increased was because there was a recession during that time period. But the evidence that we're going to cite later in our part will find that the reason your evidence finds poverty increased was only because there was a recession during that time period. But if you look towards after that recession, liberalization allowed Venezuela to recover from that recession and was on a projection of economic growth. However, in 1998, we say Chavez came into power and reversed all that liberalization and turned it into state control, which like destroyed the economy. Yeah, cool. Okay. So on your first point about like hyperinflation, you see that large external shocks like lead to inflation. So like, what is like a large external shock? Okay. Right. And can we agree that like the oil sector like has lots of large external shocks, right? Like quite often, right? Like in the top of your case, you like 2 times that it's happened, right? So can we agree that if they're not dependent on in the sector, that has massive amounts of shocks that you say lead to hyperinflation?
So where do you prove that Venezuela is diversifying right now? Because privatization and diversification are two different things.
Yeah, no, that's true. But I mean, we don't read any evidence in case where we have evidence that other private sector imports, non-oil, are increasing by 25%, and the economy is projected to grow 4%.
I mean,
and all.
So still make the minimum part of the economy. We can both agree that Venezuela is
Yeah, that's right now. Well, I disagree with the fact that we can change it, right?
So,
the comparative is in your
how do you
world.
diversify that?
You loosen state control and you allow for like private sector like enterprises in various like.
The private sector have enough to go into like agriculture and create all this new infrastructure that they need to meet the Does the private sector have enough to create the infrastructure?
Yeah, probably.
I mean, like you tell me,
lots
a lot of people are in poverty.
Yeah, that's right now. Yeah, that's under the state control policy. We see that, like, because of the reform that's happening, we see 4% growth. The private sector business is at an all-time high and it's trending upwards. So in the long term, there would be.
How much is poverty?
How much is poverty decrease?
Yeah.
We don't read a specific number when we say inflation is off, like there's like 100-fold decrease.
Yeah.
Business activity is at an all-time high. Projected growth is 4%. Yeah.
Sure. So are goods affordable in Venezuela right now?
Like not all of those, obviously, but we see that like probably the best way to make goods affordable is by giving people in Venezuela access to like a currency that isn't like super hyperinflated, which is the dollar.
I mean,
And you see that in the euro.
Right? So if
Yeah,
they're not
obviously,
obviously
they still have inflation, right? Yeah, so obviously they have inflation, but the comparative is in your world, you do nothing to solve the inflation. In our world, you're on the trajectory of decreasing.
Yeah, whatever it is that.
thank yous that I want to give out. Most of them are going to be the same as Fabi's, because I feel like I would be remiss if I didn't show my gratitude to the people who've done so much for me. So starting with coaches, Ms. West, Monty, Shafton, and Ms. Hebrans, who's doing a great job running this tournament. Our externals, Neil, Sophia, Andrew, and especially Sharon, who's been with us the whole time, and not even the rest of us, yeah, Cypress, Kia, thank you, Fabi. I don't have to say their names, but also Charlie, Daniel, Corey, and Josh, who she said is hopefully doing great in LD finals right now. They've all really done a lot to facilitate my success, and I really appreciate that. Also like to thank our friends on the circuit, Trinity, Los Altos, Hawken, Durham, and all of the other schools that have really helped us get to this point. And then my parents, my mom, who's been away this weekend but has been sending me a lot of very supportive texts, and my dad, who actually doesn't want to watch me right now, even though he's here, because last time he watched me at finals, I lost. Yeah, so finally, Bobby, we definitely haven't been together for all that long, but I would be remiss if I didn't thank you because you're the reason that I'm here right now. And also Noah Kainer, who was the person that got me into this activity. Man, whatever that was happening. Alright. Nothing fancy. I'm making sure that. Skipping history lesson. Start off with a tell you that sanctions are the reasons that we see reforms happening right now. There are a lot of problems with the narrative when it comes to it. The first is what we're going to contest the whole time, that sanctions have done absolutely nothing but threaten Maduro. This is something that you can flow as a case strand. What we're telling you is that when the U.S. imposes sanctions on Venezuela, the Maduro government sees that they are now in trouble. And when they're in trouble, they do nothing but consolidate their resources and decrease the proportion of overall government revenue that used to go to the people. Whereas in the past, before sanctions, we saw things like social programs to maintain a lifeline for the people in Venezuela that we tell you were struggling. When you affirm, you only see, or when you negate, you only see those things continue to stay away as the Maduro regime tries to consolidate power in order to maintain where they are. With that said, on to where they tell you that the inner circle has been leaving Maduro, and that's how we're going to see an indication that he's losing power. There are a few problems here, but most importantly, as you can determine, the sanctions reduce the ability to incite a peaceful transition. The Washington Post writes that sanctions have increased the use of criminal activity by government officials to generate revenue for Maduro's regime, which means that tactics like providing amnesty for officials who don't comply work. What that means is that those exact officials that they tell you are defending against Maduro, the Washington Post finds are actually increasing their illegal activity to find other revenue sources to support Maduro. That's why we see things like illegal mining and illegal drug trafficking increasing in Venezuela specifically because of sanctions, because the Maduro government needs some way to get that revenue back. They never take these sanctions as a slap in the face. They're always going to retaliate in some way, shape, or form. But moreover, Rodriguez of Foreign Policy 19 elaborates that sanctions have increased the regime's cost for exiting power as well as its incentive to defend its position. Basically, because the Maduro regime no longer has the financial capacity to exit power peacefully, they have to do so non-peacefully. And that, what we would tell you, is going to be a lot worse for the people. But moreover, our evidence postdates all of theirs about those elites turning their backs on Maduro. As we see a Politico finds about 6 days ago, that the military senior ranks and all of Maduro's elites have stuck by him despite threats from his opponents. This means that insofar as right now we tell you that the elites are supporting Maduro more than they ever have, in the long term, they don't prove you any solvency. But then, onto where they tell you that we're going to increase the amount of concessions. That's a perspective of economic liberalization. But first and most problematically, the evidence that they showed us about how sanctions can increase liberalization literally finds that the root cause of liberalization was the recession that they tell you predated all of Maduro's policies. What that means is that insofar as sanctions were the cause of liberalization, you can achieve that just as well in our world. But moreover, we're going to prove that liberalization is better in the act. Raposa 19 informs that sanctions make it increasingly difficult for Venezuela to get loans from abroad, especially if that means that the bank has to go through the American financial system. This is really unfortunate, as Mathcop 17 reports that the IMF would give loans, but would give conditions with the loan, such as privatizing aid and restoring transparency. He continues that given the choice between the current economic chaos and a new economic plan, Maduro would choose the latter. You should prefer liberalization that happens in the act world because of IMF loans for 2 reasons. The first comes from Zerpa in December of 2019, who reports that Maduro is already scaling back liberalization in the neg world. Maduro has scaled back the number of items that can enter without import taxes, claiming to build upon 21st century socialism. He's already cutting off the private sector aid from the global market. We explicitly tell you that he's been curbing back that short-term liberalization in their world, specifically because he doesn't have to do that in the long term in order to get those political concessions that he needs to remain in power. But second is we provide the capital for the private sector to flourish. Crowley 19 reports that financial institutions are cautious not to make dealings even with the private sector because it could be perceived as working for Venezuela's government. What that means is that insofar as sanctions always make the international government skeptical of Venezuela, they're never going to allow that liberalization to be successful because Venezuelan businesses can't get any financial gain or any financial kickstart. But what's most importantly is we tell you sanctions themselves depress the ability for those independent businesses within Venezuela to do anything. Specifically because the August 2019 round of sanctions that the U.S. imposed included an entire embargo on all Venezuelan companies, and what we explicitly tell you that means is that those other international nations that provide funding for those private companies in Venezuela are going to be the problem. But then, they talk to you about dollarization increasing, but we're going to cross-apply our case here. We tell you that dollarization is bad, specifically because those 70% of transactions that happen within Venezuela using the dollar only happen among the 90% of the economy that's controlled by the elites. We explicitly tell you from Merco Press that it increases income inequality. But then, on the poverty impact, what we would tell you is that beforehand, when they talk about Chile, Brazil, and El Salvador, those countries were not socialist and did not have the same type of government as we tell you Venezuela does. What we would tell you is that, like, in Venezuela, they're simply going through the motions, as I've said before, to make sure the Maduro government stays in power. If you want real, meaningful reform that isn't scapegoated by the recession, you're going to be voting for us.
We'll take some questions. I don't have that many things to use, just like what Max said, like Eshawn, Jasper, you guys helped us so much just playing it. Clemens, you helped us so much, like insights on the debate team. My parents, thank you for letting me compete. All of our friends, all of our teammates that are supporting us here and back at home. And also, opponents. I know that maybe they didn't thank us, and like they listed all their friends, but we weren't part of that list. But thank you. It's fine. Thank you so much for everything you've done for us. All right. I'm starting off on our case. Our cases of how targeted sanctions on Maduro's inner circle freeze their assets and prevent them from accessing their wealth, which makes them pressure Maduro to reform to get those sanctions lifted. They make a few responses. First, they say that sanctions threaten Maduro, and he sees that there's trouble, so he consolidates resources and doesn't spend as much on his people. They drop the Corrales evidence, which tells you, absent pressure, Maduro will always want to keep everyone in the country in poverty, because that makes them more dependent on the government. The way we know this is true is because the CSIS explained that even prior to sanctions, Maduro was not spending oil revenue on his people, he was spending it on the elites and on illegal activities. Then they tell you, in response to sanctions, Maduro will increase illegal activities. First of all, I'd say we do that anyways because it's not regulated by like financial institutions. And second, the point of sanctions means that even if they are able to shift to these illegal activities to get money, these sanctions prevent them from using that money on the international market. They cannot gain access to the wealth because of sanctions. That's why they pressure Maduro to reform. Then they tell you that Maduro will no longer be able to exit power peacefully. There's no probability that he's going to exit power peacefully in their world. It's not offensive to them. Then they tell you that the military has stuck by Maduro as of like 6 days ago. They misunderstand our argument. Our argument is not that sanctions will make the military defect away from Maduro. Our argument is that sanctions will, even though they're staying with Maduro, the inner circle will start pressuring Maduro to reform because they want to regain access to the wealth that was frozen by sanctions. We do not need to do that. Then they tell you that our evidence says the root cause of reforms was recession. That is not true. Again, the Corrales evidence tells you absent pressure, Maduro will always want to keep everyone in poverty, which is why prior to sanctions, our evidence says that they were actually accelerating the nationalist policies of Chavez, and only after sanctions, the economists and arguments say because of sanctions, they started moving away from these socialist policies. Then they read this turn about how sanctions cut Venezuela off from IMF loans, and this would be a much better way to liberalize their economy. First of all, according to Bahar of the Brookings Institute, Venezuela was considered financially toxic, and they were already cut off from financial institutions prior to sanctions being imposed. They would not have been able to access the IMF regardless. But second, Patterson of the International Economy explains that Maduro and Venezuela have been rejecting to engage with the IMF for decades. They see it as Western imperialism, but that's why they don't read you any evidence that says that Maduro actually would. Then they tell you that because of sanctions, nobody wants to make deals with the private sector. That does not make sense. The private sector is completely exempt from sanctions. We know that this is true because the Argus Institute finds, despite that argument, private sector growth is at decades-level highs. Then they tell you that 70% of dollars go to the elites. That's because dollarization happened a few months ago. Our evidence still says we are helping the poor. Shortages are being filled, the economy is still projected to improve, inflation is down 100-fold. Lastly, they say that the other countries you talk about were not socialist, so we can't compare them. First of all, they are pretty good examples. Chile was an authoritarian leader who was pressured into liberalization because of America, and also we say that doesn't even matter because in Venezuela specifically, they are making these reforms and it is helping. Let's go to their case. Their first one about hyperinflation. First of all, we say that the root cause of inflation is because of all these socialist and bad economic policies, so we solve for the root cause better. And second, the reason they say sanctions cause inflation is because when the government loses revenue, they're forced to print money, which means that this argument is predicated on their third link about losing oil revenue because that's where they get all their money. Then, their second one about dollarization. This is a reason to vote for us, because Venezuela's economic policy and standard of centralization has created distrust in foreign investors, which is why prior to sanctions, they have done consistently lower levels of investment than any other Latin American country. Fortunately, the argument in their case says that this policy of dollarization, which happened because of sanctions, has been a pressure release valve, ensuring foreign investors that Venezuela has access to a stable currency. Without the perceived embracement of the dollar, foreign capital would disappear, which would lock Venezuela into a scarcity trap without a long-term path to development. Then, the third one about oil revenues. First of all, Venezuela's oil would have collapsed with or without sanctions. At the same time, they defaulted on all their bonds, they fired all the boards, so that the Guardian finds that their oil production fell by 2/3 prior to sanctions. And second of all, sanctions won't stop oil sales any longer, because the International Affairs Council just last week finds that their state-run oil company, PDVSA, has shifted oil production to joint ventures with foreign companies that are not subject to U.S. sanctions.
So we tell you explicitly that in so far 50% of transactions happen with the dollar, but only the rich can afford those high exchange.
So 70% of Venezuela is rich?
No, so having access to the dollar is different from having a dollar.
No, it's not just having a dollar. The evidence says regularly receiving dollars.
Right, but again, regularly receiving dollars doesn't account for the increase in prices that comes along with things like dollarization.
How is that going to increase prices?
Right,
literally, so nobody could afford anything before dollars because everything was inflated out of its mind. Right, so dollars are a way that they can actually afford
insofar as the rich are the only people that have access to this stable form of currency, it just only elevates their position and their
that's
ability
not true.
to
Again, no, that is not true. Unless you can read me evidence that says that dollarization has increased prices so much that the 70% people can't access it, I'm not sure by the argument. So because our evidence specifically says that shortages of essential goods are being filled because of this.
So I'm obviously when they're talking about like what's happened as a result. So what evidence do you read me in case saying that anything other than economic indicators have changed within Venezuela? How many people have been fed? How have we seen poverty actually?
Shortages have been ended. That's the Lopez evidence.
Shortages ended?
Shortages are being filled
Shortages
right
end when 90% of Venezuelans still live in poverty.
Shortages are being filled right now. I can give you stats of how many specific people are being lifted out of poverty because, again, these reforms happened a few months ago. I can tell you all these economic indicators which always show that poverty decreased as per your own case. And also we say that in other countries, liberalization decreased poverty.
Well, so talking about those other countries specifically, right? We're looking at Chile, Brazil, and El Salvador.
Yeah.
So looking at those nations, do they have the same style of leader as Maduro? I know you're saying that the leader of Chile was corrupt. And we know our history, and that's not incorrect. But do they have the same stance as Maduro when they're first of all sanctioned at the time of liberalization, and second of all, they're sanctioned specifically by the U.S. government, who has encouraged other international actors to stop it transactions as well.
No, they weren't sanctioned by the United States. But Chile's leader was actually very against capitalism until the United States pressured them. Like he would sent a bunch of economists who started feeling a bunch of propaganda that capitalism was good. So started liberalization.
But how can you say that liberalization is as effective? Really quick.
Yeah.
How can you say that liberalization is as effective in an economy that has the largest revenue stream cut as it was in the three other states?
I can say it's going to be most effective because we have a guarantee that it occurs. We're not relying on the
liberalization doesn't mean that the liberalization is successful. The Maduro regime can put however much of the percentage of the economy into the private sector as they want.
No,
so far,
that is our argument. Our argument is that Venezuela is going to be better than us. Because in these other countries, you're relying on the dictator to do it. In Venezuela, we are sanctioning his inner circle and forcing him to do it in a way that helps everyone.
So, talking about the inner circle, how have the inner circle been?
It's not about them them defecting. We just say they
How have they
pressure Maduro to
pressured
reform.
defecting, pressuring, that basically is synonymous.
How have they pressure Maduro to reform? Losing capital controls, losing price controls, accepting dollarization.
So you're saying they're doing the reform, correct?
They have pressure Maduro to make it happen.
Not spend on these people, but the problem is we're only ordering. Before sanctions, we have being implemented by the Maduro government. Or even if you buy this, sanctions make this worse, because when he has less of a share, it means he has less of a share to give to the people. The reason why he has social programs in the first place is because he knows he wants at least some public support to actually legitimize his election. But specifically, we can also extend the term that the way sanctions occur, are the way that sanctions force the government to diversify, isn't by like going off of oil, it's going to criminal activity and illegal mining. They just say that sanctions have prevented Maduro from using from going to international markets. These problems, countries like China and Russia are ignoring sanctions, which means that they still have access to actually sell this and get and do things through illegal mining. But then you can also extend the term from Rodriguez, who tells us that right now there's no longer financial capacity to exist insofar as like sanctions prevent private companies from going in. But you can extend too, so you can tell us, as of 6 days ago, right now the elites are supporting him. That's really crucial. They say their argument isn't about sanctions, but insofar as they can't prove that the elites actually have any incentive to go against Maduro in the case that he doesn't reform, they can prove that these reforms are actually going to continue actively. But specifically, you can extend the analysis that we make, that their own card tells us that in the 90s, when they had a recession, they liberalized. This has two implications. One, it means Maduro still has an incentive to liberalize even after sanctions. But two, when we saw that liberalization, remember, in First Cross, we also said that liberalization was bad and it was breaking GDP. But moreover, you can extend Virgo, who tells us that right now Maduro is actually increasing import taxes, which is the opposite of liberalization. They can't prove that the trend right now is actually liberalizing. But specifically, you can also extend the term that right now, as of August 2019, the sanctions are an entire embargo which prevents private companies from actually getting these capital. That's really crucial. They give you the Chile and Brazil example, but they weren't sanctioned. That's why the private put through, because they actually have the ability to get capital. But then, let's go into our honor school contingent about a failed system. Rodriguez tells us that yes, although there was a crisis from 2012 to 2016, the Venezuelan economy was supposed to recover because they relied on oil, and oil prices had rebounded. What prevented that was the sanctions. We specifically tell you that through dollarization. Dollars tells us that sanctions forced the Maduro government to search for new markets. But specifically, Long tells us that right now over half of Venezuela is dollarized, and the reason why that's really bad comes from American Press, who tells us that only the rich get these dollars. They just say that the dollarization right now is allowing investors to go in. But that's really problematic. These cards for the private sectors are the ones, the private companies are the ones that's getting access to dollars. Because one, we already tell you to block buys by sanctions, but usually that's not actually affecting the people who don't actually have the ability to start private sectors. The reason why that's so important is because we need to actually first help the people get out of poverty to actually stand up to Maduro. But then second is on urgency. Sachs tells us that because they can't access medicine, 300,000 people are at risk of dying. We only solve that if we decrease poverty.
Our case one. Alright, is it one more? Our case is about how targeted sanctions on Maduro's inner circle freeze their assets and prevent them from accessing their wealth, which makes them pressure Maduro to reform the economy so they get those targeted sanctions lifted. The Argus evidence, which they never thought to find, that because of these sanctions, Maduro has already made significant reforms, erasing most price controls and capital controls and accepting dollarization. On the link label, they give a couple of responses. The first at the top, they say that Maduro feels threatened by sanctions, so he'll consolidate. First of all, this is not a turn. This is not offense for them. The CIS explains that before sanctions, Maduro wasn't spending the oil money that he got on his people. The warrant comes from Corrales that finds that he has an active incentive to keep his people in poverty because it makes them more dependent on the government, which gives him more power in the long term. Their second turn is that sanctions increase illicit activity, and that's how they get their revenue after sanctions. But they don't respond to the fact that sanctions prevent them from using this illicit revenue on international markets. They say they can go through Russia and China, but any transaction that they try to make through Russia and China goes through Western financial institutions and is blocked, which is why the Argus evidence finds that they're diversifying their economy to find new revenue sources. Their third response is that the elites will always support Maduro and they won't defect. We agree, they're never going to defect, but we see that they're going to pressure Maduro to reform the economy. They say that the elites have no incentive to pressure him, but at the point where they're not accessing their wealth because of the sanctions, they want to get him removed, that is the incentive for them to pressure. Their next response is that the root cause of liberalization was a recession, but we know this is not true because, the Corrales evidence explains that Maduro has an incentive to keep his people in poverty, which means that even if there's a recession, he's not going to want to liberalize the economy because at long term, it helps him to keep his people in poverty. If you look to history, we find that even after a recession occurred and they liberalized, they took away that liberalization, which means that recessions do not lead to liberalization. Then they say that Maduro has increased import taxes. This is to increase domestic competition. That's actually a good thing. And lastly, they say that private companies can't go into Venezuela because of the sanctions, but the United States government report found that the private sector is exempt from sanctions, which again is why the private sector is growing. This is really important because keeping sanctions and ensuring long-term economic liberalization is what leapfrogs development in Chile and Brazil and El Salvador is what cut poverty in half. We say in Venezuela that this will lift tens of millions of people out of poverty. They say those examples aren't fair. Well, in Chile, we see that they also had an authoritarian leader and they were pressured to liberalize due to United States sanctions. The weighing is simple. The hypothetical effect of lifting sanctions is super unclear because Maduro always has an incentive to restrict growth and keep people in poverty. But you know that right now the reforms are growing in the private sector and in shortages and lifting people out of poverty. On their case, on dollarization, you can turn it. Because we say that Venezuela's economy, their poor economic policies has led to a lack of investment because there's not a stable currency. Which is why the Argus evidence explains that dollarization ensures that foreign investors have a credible currency stream, which increases investment in the long term. It's really easy to weigh. They say that dollarization increases income inequality. It's already extremely high. There's no terminal impact to a marginal increase in income inequality, whereas we see that long-term liberalization is the key to cutting poverty in half.
actually the dollar goes to Western economies.
We're not talking specifically about the dollars, these illegal
Yeah,
transactions that
gold
happen
mining
with mining.
No,
gold.
Russia and China, they don't deal in the Bolivar, they don't deal in the
Right,
yuan or
right,
the.
so
or
the illegal mining they're
ruble.
doing is for gold, and that's the currency they use. So
Okay,
they're not using dollars
so
for that.
where's the other 95% of the money? Frozen.
So, oh, you're talking about like the specific oil exports?
Yes.
So we tell you that like.
And like
because
all of
that-
their assets that they kept in foreign countries that have been frozen, and all the money, all the dollars that they can't use because of sanctions.
Right, we agree that the sanctions do freeze a certain amount of their economy, but we tell you two things. First, that freezing of access is problematic, specifically, like, that's just our case, but we also tell you that the only
No,
way
it's
to
not freezing access to the
Really? Can I
people,
finish
it's
the
just
second?
freezing access
Can I
to
say
individuals.
the second part?
Yes.
Sure. So we tell you that the other way that the Maduro government has preferred over things like liberalization to increase their only source of revenue would be those illegal practices.
Then
And we tell you those
why are they
illegal-
passing the reforms and going to private sector?
Well, so we tell you that the private sector isn't been, like, one, hasn't been successful, and two, basically, like, every reform we put on our
Private
case,
sector
we say
growth
that
is
it
at
hasn't.
decades level highs, you never responded to
Also,
that.
just like import taxes are in direct contradiction.
Why did they put-
They
no,
may
no,
be great,
why did they put
but,
import
like, they're in
taxes?
direct contradiction of economics.
Why did Maduro put the import taxes?
Why did he put
Yes,
them?
it was to
I'm sure
stop
they didn't tell
foreign,
me to
it
do
was to
domestic
stop foreign
competition.
companies from giving cheap goods and out-competing their private sector. He literally did it to increase the growth of the private sector.
But that's
Liberalization does
literally-
not mean you can't have protection. That's part of
Liberalization
liberalization.
is the lessening of regulation.
Yeah, you can, every country that is liberalized has also done it while maintaining domestic protections. If he is growing his private sector, he's going to want to prevent other countries from just
So,
dumping cheap
yeah.
goods.
What's
That's not a
the
bad thing.
incentive to grow the private sector if you say the private sector, like, growth is gonna go to the poor?
That's our point. Sanctions, they
Right,
force him to do
that's
that.
my question.
Other than sanctions, he would never do that.
That you say the elites and Maduro have an incentive to increase the private sector.
Yeah.
But you also say the private sector growth is gonna go to the poor.
Yes.
How does Maduro
Okay,
benefit?
I'll explain that. Our argument is that absent sanctions, majority of the inner circle would never want to help the poor because they want to keep everyone dependent on the economy. Our point is the way they make them change it is because sanctions target their inner circle, they freeze their assets, and force Maduro to reform because he needs his inner circle to remain in
But
power.
like, if it, like, privatization isn't gonna help Maduro, then why would he reform?
Because
Like,
again,
I get the
he
part that, like,
he
Maduro
cares
is
more
concerned
about
the
his
poor.
inner circle than he cares about keeping the poor dependent on
How
him.
does privatization help his inner circle?
Because again, privatizing means the sanctions get lifted off of his inner circle, they get access to all of their money.
Wait, that's not privatization. Like, for that
No,
to
no, no.
happen, the officials would have to.
No, no, that's not what privatization is. Our argument is that when they make those privatization reforms, the United States loosens sanctions on inner circle, that's how they gain their money back. You have like 10 seconds.
Yeah, so.
Is everybody good? It's gonna go from our case from here. Rodriguez tells you that between 2012 and 2016, the Venezuelan economy fell, and it would have recovered had it not been for sanctions. The reason we tell you sanctions have been problematic is because of our second warrant of dollarization. Long finds that because the Venezuelan government has been forced to seek out new markets, half of every Venezuelan transaction happens in the dollar. The reason dollarization is problematic is because Merco Press finds that only the wealthy can afford to dollarize, which increases income inequality. The terminal impact of that comes from Medea, who finds that poverty, like that sanctions have decreased GDP by 37.4%, and Moreno finds that because only Maduro and the rich can get access to that, the poor have been pushed further down than they ever have been before. Their only response is that they can turn it because dollarization increases the investment into those specific businesses. However, when they tell you that dollarization increases investment into businesses, it only increases investment into those businesses owned by the wealthy. That's what Poppy tells you in summary. Because only the wealthy have access to those foreign markets and have access to the dollar, those like foreign businesses that are investing and choose to invest in businesses with the dollar only invest in those wealthy businesses. That supercharges our link into dollarization, increases income inequality, and that's a reason to vote for us. But even still, we outweigh for a few key reasons, and the first is on a prerequisite analysis. Insofar as their entire case hinges on the ability for the poor to be able to start their own businesses and to take up a larger sector of the market, they need to prove that they gain access to any initial spur of capital in order to do that. But insofar as we tell you that dollarization only pushes them further down, they don't gain access to that point of the link where the people can find any benefit. But moreover, we outweigh on probability. It's a lot more likely that these sanctions, which they give you zero terminal impact at the end of the round as to what they've done, are good than it is that they've been stunting Venezuelan economic growth as we've seen would have happened in the past had it not been for the sanctions. But then, onto their case. Extend the turn at the top where we tell you that whenever we have sanctions on the Maduro government, it threatens them and forces them to consolidate their resources, cutting benefits to the people. They extend corrals to find that the Maduro government will always keep their people in poverty. But they drop Fabi's responses where they find that first, the Maduro government always needs popular support. That's why empirically we found that before sanctions, they had lifeline programs to keep people from literally starving, but those got specifically cut because of sanctions. But moreover, we would tell you that poverty, they give you no terminal impact as to how that's actually decreased since the inception of sanctions, but we can explicitly show you all of these 300,000 people that are currently in poverty in Venezuela right now. But then finally, remember, those private businesses can't find success under sanctions insofar as the only other markets in the world that would want to invest in Venezuela, the US, and the other international actors that the US is working with don't want to invest there because of sanctions.
The last 20 seconds. I'm going to start off, like, the turn on their case and then finish off. They do not handle the turn on their case well at all. Their terminal impact of dollarization is that it increases income inequality. But Max gives you the weighing analysis that income inequality in Venezuela prior to this was already terminally high. You don't know the difference in income inequality before or after dollarization. You do know the difference because of the Argus media that says that dollarization has created a stable currency in Venezuela, which gives foreign investors the confidence to invest and export things to Venezuela to grow their private sector. We tell you that this is crucial to giving Venezuela capital, which is the most important impact in this round. This ends the round right now because it does not matter if income inequality is high if Venezuela does not have capital, because capital is the prerequisite to having a long-term development plan. They cannot help their poor if they have no money in their economy. The only way to get money in their economy is with dollarization. There's no terminal impact of income inequality that's extended in the last two speeches. But let's go to our case. We're also winning there. We tell you that targeted sanctions on Maduro's inner circle freeze their assets, prevent them from accessing their wealth, which forces them to pressure Maduro to reform to gain access back to their wealth. They extend two responses. First, they extend this saying that because of sanctions, Maduro cuts social spending. Again, we tell you the Corrales evidence, which also is the best weighing analysis in this round. What that tells you is that absent pressure, Maduro wants to keep everyone in poverty because that will make them dependent on the government and give Maduro more power. Here's why that's important. It means that any growth that happens in a world without sanctions is always going to help the rich. There's no incentive for him to give to the poor. The only world in which he does help the poor is when sanctions target his inner circle and force him to do so. CSI evidence tells you empirically, Maduro has not spent on his people for sanctions. The last thing they extend is that because sanctions hurt the private sector, we're not going to be seeing liberalization. That does not respond to Max's reform line. The private sector is completely exempt from sanctions, while the Argus evidence from last month says they have gained more imports and investment because of the reforms that sanctions have caused. We tell you, keeping sanctions ensuring long-term liberalization will leapfrog development with tens of millions of people out of poverty within the other countries. We tell you this is the best link into their case. Because sanctions, like economic crisis, is always going to exist in Venezuela. The root cause is the fact that they have not liberalized. We affect way more people than they do for a much longer time. We are well.